Medal of Honor was one of the most expensive and hyped games in all of VR history, and for today's video I went back in to try and find out what was promised, what we got, and how it shapes up in 2025. Now keep in mind the multiplayer is now offline, and from memory, even though it was good fun, it lacked drive for players to keep playing due to zero progression, so for today's video that will be left out. To get you all in the correct mindset, I need to take you back to 2020, where nothing seemed impossible for virtual reality and investors were all betting big. Everyone involved believed the technology was about to take over the world, and all we needed was high-end expensive PCVR games to do it. And there's plenty of proof of this, especially from Oculus Studios. Medal of Honor Above and Beyond was developed by Respawn Entertainment. Now Respawn is an extremely well known and respected developer thanks to the very popular and utterly brilliant Titanfall. And as we know, it's important to get big IPs into VR and capture the attention of flat screen users. So with Respawn making it, EA publishing it, and Oculus funding it, surely we would have a 10 out of 10 in our virtual hands. Unfortunately, much like many big hitters that come to VR, the launch was met with negativity, mostly down to bugs, a lack of understanding what current players were expecting, along with some weird choices, and some broken up and unengaging gameplay. So in case some of you missed or may have forgotten the Medal of Honor marketing campaign, which featured some truly excellent game trailers, watching these again today and reading the info that was available at the time makes you realise some pretty big promises were made by both Respawn and Oculus that never materialised. Also, we need to take into account Medal of Honor at the time wasn't nearly as relevant as maybe Oculus thought it was. The last game in the Medal of Honor series was 8 years earlier, called Warfighter, and it flopped pretty hard in 2012, and interest in the series was already dying, with most players preferring Call of Duty. And this got me thinking, why did Oculus pick Medal of Honor anyway? Imagine going to the developers of Titanfall and saying, we have millions of dollars to spend, and instead of making a Titanfall VR game, which you are clearly the best people at the job for, we want you to make a World War II game, which you have never done before, using a franchise that not many people care about. Plus, it will be your first VR game, so here's the money and good luck. So once that terrible conversation most likely happened, the next hard job was to get players hyped for Medal of Honor, not only coming back to gaming, but also this time exclusively for virtual reality. Now the first time we learned of the tone Medal of Honor Above and Beyond was going to take was at Oculus Connect 4 back in 2017, and it was pitched as a true boots on the ground, real gritty World War II experience, allowing you to take on the roles of fallen soldiers in some very key battles and important moments and turning points in World War II, and players could expect to experience life as a soldier in real combat. Again, you need to keep in mind this game was fully funded by Oculus, and as the game progressed in development, it's clear the realism that was spoken of eventually is thrown out the window, and someone, somewhere decided what VR needs is perhaps something more light-hearted. The developers originally wanted you to feel things like paranoia, tension, fear, adrenaline, and anger. And I believe VR can give players all these emotions as I felt them myself, but what we got when it was delivered isn't anything like this at all. What we got? When Medal of Honor first launched on PC, it was pretty much celebrated across the board for lovely visuals, but only if you had the hardware to run it. It also lacked any meaningful graphical settings, and choosing anything but high made the game look soft and pretty unappealing, and it definitely lacked the optimization of say games like Half-Life Alyx, leaving players mostly frustrated. There was also a lot of controversy about the install size. Originally, it was rumoured to be a 170 gig download that unpacked to a whopping 340 gig, but this was addressed and it now sits at 181 gigs. That is obviously still pretty huge, but the game is filled with tons of varying and beautiful environments that you get to experience over the 8 hours it'll take you to finish, and you never see the same area twice outside of briefing rooms and the firing range. So the game released and was pretty much treated as a very mid title, with a Metacritic score of 66 and user review sitting around 6.6. So the future of Medal of Honor seemed bleak, but news spread of it ported to the immensely popular Quest 2 a year later. But the install size also meant that every owner on a 64 gig Quest 2 might be unable to play it, and when you look at it now, it seems crazy that a 64 gig Quest 2 ever existed. How it shapes up today. Now going back into the game, there's something that stands out more to me than anything else while I played, and it's that Medal of Honor feels like a parody of a war game, with small jokes here and there and light-hearted moments. Throughout the game, you are regularly hanging around with this dickhead who is always smiling and talking American when you're both meant to be undercover and surrounded by Nazis. And there's even moments where he gives you the thumbs up. It's quite literally immersion breaking, but this is accurate for the tone of the entire game, and throughout my time playing Medal of Honor, it feels at odds with itself. It's a constant battle between telling a true story or just trying to be entertaining, and it never finds its identity. As a player, you end up feeling more like a viewer than a participant, mostly due to the lack of connection with the emotion of the game. And this is really unfortunate because the game has the stages and the story for you to feel part of really big VR moments that help win the war. But regardless of how good it looks, there is so much effort put into making the player feel like they're having a good time. Overall, it just doesn't feel like it lands right. There are moments in the cutscenes though that you feel part of the story and the seriousness of what's going on, but it's very few and far between. Speaking of feeling, there is some very emotional interviews outside of the game with war veterans, and some of these are in 360. These are the most serious thing about the game, and brilliant to watch. You can't help but be moved by the stories of the sacrifices from these war heroes who risked their lives and the many soldiers who gave their today so we could have a tomorrow. Unfortunately, this is the most serious part of Medal of Honor, and when jumping back in today, these clips don't feel like they really fit in with the rest of the game at all. There are thankfully a few more positives to go over. The graphics can look absolutely fantastic. There's some brilliant set pieces and great looking environments you can't help but be impressed with. There's also some excellent moments like having a tank go over your head, racing through a moving train with a trench gun, and storming Omaha Beach. That didn't disappoint. There is also a tank section which is a particular favourite of mine, but using head tracking for aiming is something I completely forgot even existed, and it's very strange to experience in 2025. And this also happens a few more times throughout the game whenever there's a gun turret involved. But again, this is unfortunately all let down by some pretty janky animations, with NPCs dying 1.5 seconds after being shot. Some are simply floating around and stuck in weird animations, and overall the game definitely needed more time in the developer oven, which it clearly never got because all the focus, I imagine, was then put into the development of the Quest version. Now onto the Quest version, this is graphically very impressive considering it was made for the Quest 2 chipset, with Quest 3 merely being a rumour back in 2021. I always say that Blade and Sorcery Nomad is the best PCVR Quest port we've ever had, but Medal of Honor Above and Beyond is definitely a contender, especially in terms of visuals. Sure, there is less grass, lower textures and shadows, but it looks insanely crisp on Quest 3 with the pancake lenses, and aside from a few graphical hiccups, it's exactly the same game. And overall, I was impressed with what I saw on PCVR, and that definitely continued into the Quest version. The weapons all look great and feel good to use, especially the Winchester style shotgun you can spin to reload. And if all you're here to do is shoot Nazis, then just stay in the shooting gallery, which features an infinite number of real Nazis running back and forth for your gunning pleasure. Again, while doing this, I questioned how this made sense in a game all about realism. The music in this game also doesn't really make much sense, and it feels like your character is wearing headphones who is listening to classical music, and it feels like it has no place or reason to be playing in your ears at certain moments, and again, this assists in removing any tension. This is all compounded by the very short sequences in between loading screens, and there is a lot of them, and they constantly fade to black, especially in the first chapter of the game. Another thing that never lets up on the list of annoyances are your hands. As we all know, VR hands are the key for you to feel part of the world, but these huge pieces of virtual meat are the worst forearm hands in VR I've experienced in a long time. The scale is also about 1/3 too big, and because your hands don't bend at the wrist, they just feel terrible and add to feeling disconnected. Some of the guns are manually reloaded, which is really cool, but some of them are a button press. Why have some that are realistic and some that aren't? It's all these little things that appear to be working hard to remind you this is only a game. Dying has zero consequence, the enemies sometimes respawn out of midair right in front of you, no one swears, and even though everything is interactable, hardly anything is solid. And when you're standing around being briefed, which can be extremely boring, these moments are bound to trigger everyone's ADHD into picking all manner of shit up and throwing it around because you simply want to play the game versus being told about the game. Going through the reviews, many people left review scores of around 3.5, and I would argue most of these didn't get past the first chapter of the game. There's 8 missions that are all around an hour in length, but the way the first mission presents itself to the player is again hugely unimmersive, and it's quite boring overall. You go from long, probably humorous cutscenes to being allowed to shoot maybe 6 to 8 NPCs, and then you're again thrown back into a cutscene, and this goes on for the first hour, and I would guess you're standing around talking just as much as you are actually playing. Luckily, as the game progresses, this happens less, and the levels start to open up more, letting you play for much longer. But as first impressions go, it's incredibly boring most of the time, and then you combine that with everything else I've mentioned earlier, it's really not hard to see why some people got out pretty quickly and probably went for the refund. In my opinion, you simply shouldn't leave VR players in the dark during loading screens, but Medal of Honor loves this practice, and sometimes it puts players in front of a giant monolith stating the game's name, trying to remind you what you're actually playing, just in case you forget during the long loading times. Thankfully, these are much shorter on the Quest version. Overall, I think everyone was right to give this game 3 out of 5. It's a good shooter with great graphics, with some stunning set pieces, but there's also plenty of moments you'll be feeling player fatigue due to not caring about what's going on right in front of you. It's got a great campaign length, and every chapter has something new to see, but Medal of Honor Above and Beyond is nowhere near as impactful as it thinks it is, and is still a missed opportunity overall. It was a chance to bring VR a truly spectacular, cinematic and emotional VR game. Instead, we got a light-hearted shooter with this dickhead.